So, here we are in week 3 of our series, Jesus and We. In week 1, we thought about the need that we have to have a big faith because we have a big God. And from that, we said that we need to be faith-filled, big-thinking risk-takers. Faith-filled, big-thinking risk-takers. We must never insult God with small thinking or safe living. In week 2, we thought about serving and serving others. Reminded that we are not supposed to be spiritual consumers. Rather, we're supposed to be spiritual contributors. Remembering that the church does not exist for us. We are the church and we exist for the world. So today, I want to talk about giving and irrational generosity. Irrational generosity. In the reading today, we were reminded that Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive. And that's probably not what the world would suggest. But Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive. I think one of the things that's quite common in Scotland, not just in church, but in general, is this kind of scarcity mindset. It's the mindset that says we never have enough. We're never going to have enough. We've never had enough. There's never enough to go around. It sometimes shows itself in an attitude that says, take what you can, when you can, because you'll maybe not get another chance. Or it can show itself with your first question always being, what will it cost me? It might even, we'll come back to that, someone with an abundant mindset believes that there's always more. There's always more. And if we take it from a faith perspective, we serve an abundantly powerful God who has promised to provide for us. And when you look at some of the adjectives that are used in the Bible to describe how God gives, Paul says he lavishes his grace on us. There's nothing skimping about that. He lavishes his grace on us. God gives much more than we deserve. Some of you may still be fasting. Some of you have done your 10 days and said, right, that's enough for me. Some of you may still be fasting. So you won't appreciate the example of the apple pie again. However, let's suppose we had an apple pie. And you cut a quarter and you take it. And I look at it and go, wait a minute. There's not going to give me enough left for me and for the other people who want apple pie. I'm having my bit right now. In fact, I'll have a quarter as well. Because I want my bit. That's scarcity thinking. It's the thinking that says when somebody gives you a bottle of ginger wine, no, I'm not opening it this morning, I'm keeping it for myself. An abundance mindset says, have you had enough apple pie? Because I can always get another one. There's more. In 2 Corinthians, Paul writes to the church in Corinth, and in chapter 8, verses 1 to 7, he says this, and now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. And they exceeded our expectations. They gave themselves first of all to the Lord, and then, by the will of God, also to us. And so we urged Titus, just as he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. But since you excel in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge, in complete earnestness and in love we have kindled in you, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. Paul was trying to encourage the Christians in Corinth to be more generous. And so he uses this example of the churches in Macedonia. And he says they were living in extreme poverty. But in the midst of that extreme poverty, in the midst of the trial they were facing, they were irrationally generous. Paul says they gave beyond their ability. How can you do that? How can you give beyond your ability? Because you trust that God will meet your needs. Let's just pause for a moment and ask ourselves, when was the last time you gave as much as you were able and then maybe pushed it that wee bit more? It's quite a convicting question, really. Notice Paul says about the Macedonians that it was entirely on their own, that they hadn't been asked. Nobody was going begging. They decided they wanted to do this. They wanted to respond to what they knew of God. They pleaded to be involved. Now we've got no idea, but I wonder if Paul said something like this to them. Do you know, no, don't worry. You've got enough troubles of your own. You're going through this trial. You don't have any money. We'll just leave it and let some of the wealthier, richer churches meet this need. It's the kind of thing we would say, isn't it? I don't know if Paul or if any of the others said that. But here are people who said, no, we want this opportunity to be involved in this service for God. They pleaded for the privilege of being able to give. And how different that is from what we see very often in the West today. As a congregation, we have been very fortunate in that when a specific need has risen, we have experienced some of this generosity. But lots of congregations rely on fetes or car boot sales or other gimmicks to raise money. And if you have a quick look at Christian TV, some of the stuff that goes on there in order to raise money is appalling. For only $10, you can have a prayer straight from the pastor. Buy a hanky. I've blessed it. Do you know, some of the stuff is just ridiculous. Have some anointing oil straight from the slopes of Mount Sinai. Do you know? Only $100. It's yours. That's cheap at half the price. People do daft things in order to raise money. Sadly, some people fall for it. Having exceeded everyone's expectations then, these folk have done something amazing. And Paul explains the reason for their generosity. He says, they gave themselves first to the Lord. Before they were willing to give to other people, they had to give themselves to God. Their relationship with God was right. They gave themselves first. And in doing so, they experienced the love and the grace of God in their own lives. And it was because they understood that God was for them that they were able to respond and be for others. They knew God and they were able to be generous. So Paul says to the people in Corinth, you've got it all. Faith, wisdom, love. So make sure that you also excel in giving. And notice that it's the grace of giving. It's not supposed to be a burden. It's supposed to be a blessing, because it's more blessed to give than to receive. I think that's a message still for the church today. And a message for us. We have so much to be thankful for. But we need to learn irrational generosity, to excel in the grace of giving. Why? Because we truly believe that it's more blessed to give than to receive. Over the last couple of weeks, we've looked at the scale of 1 to 10. And in our heads, we've put a little mark on it where we thought we would fall on that scale. So today, the question is about generosity. Are you more or less generous in character and mindset? Now, I would dare to suggest that none of us are a 10, unless you gave your life for the sins of the world. Probably not. Probably not be a 10. Probably none of us are going to be a 1, but think about it. You might give what people would consider to be a lot of money, but for you, actually, it's not a lot. It is possible to give a big amount and yet not really be generous. And yet, on the other hand, you might give something that other people would think is not very much, but for you, it's a huge amount. It's generous beyond what you would expect. I want you to think about it. Maybe not so much in how you give, but maybe think about how much you keep for yourself. Just go through your mind and, maybe you're somebody who tithes. Maybe on top of that, you give offerings. Maybe you've even got a giving budget that you stick to. Maybe you also give a lot of your time and you volunteer for things, and you might think you're up there at a 7 or an 8 or a 9. Maybe on the other hand, you're somebody who finds it difficult to give. Maybe right now you're thinking, why are we talking about this again in the church? Well, let's call it what it is. People are sensitive to this subject and don't like it. And that could be an indication of a scarcity mindset. And maybe that tips you a little bit lower on the scale. How much do you keep? How much do you really use what you have to be a blessing to others? Where would you put yourself on the scale of 1 to 10? You see, what I want to do, if you are a follower of Jesus, is to encourage you to become irrationally generous. You see, it doesn't make sense. That's why it's irrational. To the world, it doesn't make sense that you take 1/10 of your income and you give it to God. It doesn't make sense. And yet, those who do it would tell you that the 90% with God is more than the 100% without. It's irrational. In the world's eyes, it does not make sense. And for many believers, it doesn't make sense either, because they haven't quite got it yet, that God will never be in your debt. Of course, you don't have to be a Christian to be irrationally generous. Loads of people in the world are incredibly, wildly generous. You don't have to be a Christian, but if you are, I believe that we really should be irrationally generous with what God trusts to us. Isaiah 32:8 says this: "But generous people plan to do what is generous, and they stand firm in their generosity." They plan to do what's generous. Generous people plan to be generous, and they stand firm in their generosity. They plan to do it. Stingy people plan more how not to do it and how to keep for themselves. A generous person plans to give, and they plan how they can be more generous, and they stand firm in their generosity. When all of culture says, consume, 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 a generous person stands firm and says, no, I will give and give and give, Because giving is not just what I do, giving is who I am. And don't miss the power of that. Giving is not just something we occasionally do. Giving is a mark of our relationship with God. A couple of years ago, the Kirk session decided that instead of doing a big stewardship drive where we contact everybody and we ask everybody for money and to increase their offerings and all of that kind of stuff, that what we would do is be a little bit more key, and just during the year we would have sermons just to remind people of the need to keep giving and to think about what we're giving to God. But if we're being honest, we have some members who, as far as we can tell, are not giving financially to the church. We understand that there are good reasons sometimes why people adjust their offerings to give less, but to give nothing. That looks a lot like spiritual consumption rather than spiritual contributing. Some people make up for the fact that they don't have much money to give and to make a financial offering by giving their time and their talent and ability instead. And of course, we have lots of people who do both. We are blessed in that regard. When the church cooker broke, we simply said that if anyone wanted to make a contribution, it would be received gratefully. And we received contributions. People were generous. We received enough not only to pay for the cooker, but also to go towards new worktops, which we badly needed in the cafe. And people were willing to have it spent in that way. There are generous people here, and it's great to see. As we launch the Path of Renewal process, it's good to know that the central committees of the church are putting some money into that process, that they're paying for training for the ministers who are involved. They're paying for training for the teams that we've to develop as time goes on. They're putting money into that process in a way that they've not done before, realizing that it's better to be together and to work together and to have resources than to be doing stuff on our own. I hope also to get some financial support from Presbytery. Many of the other presbyteries have already decided that they're giving money to support the work in their own areas. But there's also a need for us to begin to put resources together for training, for equipping, and to build a fund that we will use in the future when we're further along in the process. The thing is, it can't be instead of what we already give. It has to be an addition. And so over the next few months, I want you to think about being generous, specifically with regard to the Path of Renewal process. If you want to give to that, please write on the envelope that's what it's for, or tell Robert. Robert, hello, he's up the stairs. If you don't know Robert, I can point him out to you. But if we're told that's what it's for, we can keep it separate for that purpose. As part of this process, we're going to ask people to join a team. And that's going to require them to put in a significant commitment of time, because it has to be the priority for those who are involved. We're asking a lot. We are asking a lot. I know that. But we've been given a lot by God. Acts chapter 4, verses 32 through to 35. See this. All the believers were one in heart and in mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. It talks of the generosity of the early church because God's grace was so powerfully at work among them. His grace was at work. They experienced that, and it changed them. Could it be possible today Could it be? Well, what I want to say is that if we would allow God's grace to impact our lives, He would so set us on fire that we would lead the way in irrational generosity, because we know what we've received. We know that we can trust Him. We know that He will come through. We know that He will bless us. We know that the 90% with Him is worth much more than the 100% without Him. I believe that we would meet not only our own needs within the congregation, but the needs of people in our communities, and so get their attention. Wouldn't it be great to be part of a group who are irrationally generous, who start with a tithe and then go into offerings beyond that? A group of people who don't feel entitled, but see themselves as entrusted with resources from God, resources to do more than they believed possible. And when people see that, when they see this thing that they don't understand, irrational generosity, people will not understand it, but they're going to ask, why are you doing that? What is that about? There's the opportunity to go and say, it's about God. It's because we love God and He loves us, and we want to share Him with you. We want to share our blessings with you and make a difference in your life. As followers of Jesus, we should be irrationally generous because we serve the most generous God. Therefore, we should lead the way with irrational generosity because we truly believe that it's more blessed to give than to receive. Amen. All of these things start when our relationship with God is right.